So with that, oh, I hear somebody's speakers on. There we go. I will go ahead and start our recording. Thank you. Councilor Rosenthal. Councilor Nolan. Morning. Councilor Simpson.
President, good morning, Connor.
Morning. I believe that President Peterson will be joining us shortly, and Deputy Council President Wong.
Hi, I'm Allie, and I'm a North America keeper here at the Oregon Zoo. Safety is our #1 priority, not only for our guests, but our staff members who work very closely with these animals, and of course for the beloved animals. I'm in the beaver habitat at the zoo, and you're at the Metro Regional Center. The council chambers are located on the 3rd floor. In the event of a fire or fire alarm, please exit through the door in the northeast corner of the room, go down the stairway to the 2nd floor, exit through the main entrance by the reception desk, and gather in the courtyard outside the entrance. In the event of a medical or fire emergency, please call 911 and notify the agent at the reception desk. The nearest defibrillator is mounted on the steps leading from the reception desk down to Grand Avenue. Thank you, and please come visit us here at the Oregon Zoo.
Coming through.
This data, which will help us inform the implementation of our policies to improve bulky waste services for people throughout the region and potentially reduce illegal dumping of these items. Presenting the results of the study today, we have Thomas Eggleston, Policy and Program Development Manager, Casey Melnick, Associate Planner, and Rachel Chu, Senior Planner. Welcome.
Thank you, Deputy Council President, councilors. Nice to be with you this morning. We're here today, as Deputy Council President Wong noted, to talk about bulky waste collection services. We do have a presentation. Bring it up, Connor. Thank you very much. And as noted, I am joined by Casey Melnick and Rachel Chu, and they will properly introduce themselves for the record when we get to their part of the slides too. So next slide, please. So today's presentation is intended to provide you with an update on the overarching bulky waste policy project that's been going on for a couple of years now, and the study that is a part of it, the bulky waste collection study. Rachel and Casey will zero in on the results of the study, and they will also touch on an accompanying single-family program interview study that we did as well. And before we get any further, just like to clarify that the term bulky waste is a term we're using in this presentation throughout. And when we talk about bulky waste, we're talking about large household items that don't generally fit in garbage or recycling containers. So think about things like mattresses, couches, large chairs, tables, those types of things. Next slide, please. This timeline may look familiar to you. It does provide a high-level overview of the bulky waste policy project, its distinct phases of work, and the various points along the way we've engaged you all. The Bulky Waste Policy Project is a joint effort between Metro and our city and county partners, and it's primarily focused on expanding bulky waste collection services in the region so that they are convenient, accessible, regularly occurring, and with a focus on multifamily properties and tenants in multifamily properties. The focus on community members living in the multifamily sector is intentional. People residing in the approximately 7,000 properties across the region often lack access to bulky waste services. In the multifamily sector, generally property managers manage garbage and recycling collection services on their properties. This means that tenants often lack access to those services. They're direct account holders with their service providers, or often don't even know who their service providers are. This makes it challenging for tenants to manage materials on their own. And it highlights the importance of working on solutions for this sector with a focus. We also believe this sector has generally been underserved by the solid waste system. And if we can create solutions that will serve the multifamily sector, they will also benefit the single family sector as well. This project is broken down into 5 phases of work. Phases 1 and 2 wrapped up at the end of last year, and we focused on community engagement, working with property managers and tenants, and also planned refined the collection options for this collection study that we're going to be reporting out on today. So with the completion of this collection study, that wraps up phase 3, and then we'll begin moving into phase 4 and 5, where we're working on developing some potential rule or standard options that will wrap up by the end of this year. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Casey to get started on the collection service results. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you, Council President Peterson, Metro Councilors. My name is Casey Melnick. I use she and they pronouns, and I'm an associate solid waste planner with WPEZ. I'm going to provide an overview of the collection study. I'd like to first acknowledge the partners of this study. Without these folks, this work would not have been possible. The City of Gresham served as the regulating jurisdiction. They provided all of the property site recruitment. They led much of the outreach coordination effort, and they installed the large signs that were placed at each property, indicating to residents where to place items out for collection. The 2 collection companies that operated these studies routes were Gresham Sanitary Service, who's here with us today, and WM. And Trash for Peace conducted all of the resident outreach flyering effort. And we partnered with Community Warehouse, our local nonprofit furniture bank, to assess the opportunity to reuse items from the multifamily bulky waste collection stream. Next slide, please. The study was a weekly study, and it operated over 16 weeks. It was operating at 40 multifamily properties, which amounted to about 2,800 multifamily units. So it was over 16 weeks from October of 2023 to January of 2024. And each route was operated with either a box truck or a flatbed truck with 2 drivers on each route. Next slide, please. So I want to acknowledge that there's much about this service that we didn't know going in, as there are not many examples of en route multifamily bulky waste collection. So our primary objective was to gather data to better understand material generation rates, frequency that properties utilize the service, meaning were there items set out for collection, and the cost to operate the study. We also did some material characterization as well as assessing the opportunity to reuse items. So coming out of this work, we hope that these results can be used to inform updates to Metro administrative rules and will support future service planning. We also conducted interviews with 6 property managers at the conclusion of the study for additional qualitative information. So with that, I'd like to pass it to Rachel Chu to share some of the results of the study.
Thank you, Casey. Good morning, Council President Peterson, Metro Councilors. My name is Rachel Chu. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a planner on the analytics team in WPEZ. Before I dive into some of the numeric results, I just want to reiterate that having these data is an exciting milestone. One of the key pieces needed to move forward on bulky waste collection for multifamily residents were numeric benchmarks about cost and demand for the service. So with this study results, we now have concrete benchmarks that can help with policy implementation and with planning services. So it's really exciting. Moving to the benchmarks, the first one I'll cover is generation of bulky waste, or how much material was set out. So the chart on the slide shows that between 2 to 4 tons of material were collected each week. And this remained pretty consistent across the 16 weeks of the study, as we can see in the light blue band. That amount is equivalent to each multifamily household generating about 150 pounds per year, which is the same as a mattress and a large armchair per year. This also translates into about 3 pounds per apartment unit per week, which is a really tiny number, but it is also a really helpful number to feed into a service plan for any jurisdiction that knows the number of apartment units in their area, and that can help estimate generation for that area. Next slide. So this slide looks at how often properties set up materials for collection. And because the service was one of the first of its kind, we wondered if we build it, will they come? And the results indicate that yes, there is demand for a regular collection service. And we now have a benchmark for the frequency that multifamily properties might use the service. So specifically, on average, the properties use the service twice or 3 times per month. And we did see that the larger the property, the more likely they were to use the service. So this slide shows the number of times per month that different size properties use the service. So looking at the far left side, the smallest properties of less than 20 units use the service about 1 to 2 times per month. And then in comparison on the far right, the largest property complexes, the 100 plus, 400 plus unit properties, they tend to use it closer to 3 to 4 times per month. So the more units, the more frequent they use the service, the smaller the properties, the fewer times per month they use the service. Next slide. So this slide talks about the cost of operating the collection study service. And we've actually broken this element of cost up into a couple of slides. So this one looks at the total cost per ton to operate the study each week. So if we put all weeks together, on average, it costs between $750 to $1,000 per ton to operate the collection service. Another finding that I'll share here is that when we added up all the costs from both of the collection companies each week, we observed that 30% of the total costs covered disposal and the remaining 70% covered collection of the bulky waste. Next slide. So this slide puts the cost in terms of multifamily households. Thinking about the cost for a weekly service, which is on the left side of the slide, it costs about $4.30 per household per month. And then because, as we saw on a few slides back, not many properties didn't use the service every week, we also estimated the cost for a once a month service, which was $2 per household per month. So these are benchmarks we didn't have before, and they're starting points really for understanding the cost impacts of a bulky waste collection service. Next slide. So moving next to what types of bulky items were set out during the study. The key benchmark on this slide is that 75% of the items that were characterized in the study were furniture. So that's represented by the dark blue, the large yellow, and large gray slices of the pie. And these were included both upholstered and unupholstered furniture, as well as mattresses and box springs. So this benchmark really, this gives those planning collection services an idea or a validation of what to expect and to plan their operations and their equipment for. I'll also add that when it comes to mattresses, the Mattress Extended Producer Responsibility Program is scheduled to begin in late 2024 or early 25, and that may have some impact on a bulky waste collection service. Specifically, it may lower the disposal costs that may have been incurred if the mattresses had been sent to the landfill, as they are prior to the implementation of that program. Next slide. We also partnered with Community Warehouse to better understand the opportunity to collect reusable items from the multifamily bulky waste stream. And just kind of cutting right to the chase, what we saw is that the majority of the items that were collected were already at the end of their useful life. If we look at the second bullet on the slide, 76% were not in good condition or not in a working order that they could be reused as is. The other thing we noticed is that the majority were wet because they had to be set outside for collection outdoors. We saw on the prior slide that many of the items were upholstered or mattresses, so they were particularly affected by this. So the takeaway really here is that the opportunity for reuse when it comes to bulky waste so let me just start over here. The opportunity for reuse appears to be limited when we're talking about multifamily bulky waste at the point of disposal. And this is a really useful finding in itself at this time. It can help us hone our efforts to support reuse to before that point when items are collected for end-of-life disposal. So with that, I'll hand it back to Casey.
Thanks, Rachel. So we've shared with you some of the quantitative results of the study, and I'd like to share a few insights from the 6 property manager interviews that we conducted at the conclusion of the study. Some of what we heard, thank you, next slide. Some of what we heard from property managers included that bulky waste collection can be ad hoc, expensive, and time-intensive. Property managers shared that they are already incurring costs each month to manage bulky waste collection at their properties. Property managers expressed that collection from as often as weekly to up to once per month could be a good collection frequency, which is great. It aligned with the study's data results that we found related to service utilization. And property managers also noted that consistent service with resident awareness can reduce conflicts and ease the burden on property managers. We did also conduct a resident survey, which was available through the final outreach flyer. We received 14 responses from that resident survey, and participants shared whether or not they use the service and how often they might use a future service. In addition to the phase 3 resident survey, we did do extensive resident outreach during phases 1 and 2 of this work. We did also hear, we had conversations with our stakeholders, the 2 collection companies and the city of Gresham. And a few things that we heard from those conversations were that determining a designated location and clear signage at each property will help ensure that both residents and collection companies have safe and convenient access to both store and collect materials, and that smaller properties with limited exterior space may face additional challenges to manage bulky waste due to space constraints. Next slide. So I'm going to shift gears now, and I'd like to share a few details about the single-family program interviews. So rather than conducting a single-family collection study, staff leveraged local and national examples of residential bulky waste collection programs. Project team interviewed staff at 16 jurisdictions, providing bulky item collection to customers as a regular part of garbage service. And some of the data from those interviews included participation, which was measured as how many households set out materials. The average participation was 19% of households. For generation, which was measured as how much material was set out by weight in pounds, the average was about 70 pounds per household per year. So that's equivalent to about 1 large mattress, a small couch, or an appliance. Some of the other highlights from those interviews included that programs generally result in a manageable amount of material, and most customers who participate only participate once or twice per year. So even when there were programs that offered collection service more frequently, participation really dropped off after that first and second occurrence. And that customer scheduled collection was the most common form of service offered. That's as opposed to having a set day collection where, like, for example, every June 1st and October 1st. But that customer scheduled service where a resident can call up when they need the service, that was the most common form of service that was offered through these programs. With that, we can go to the next slide, and I'll pass it back to Tom for next steps.
Thanks, Casey. To wrap things up real quickly here, I'll touch on some next steps. So we are currently getting ready to start on phase 4 of this bulky waste policy project, as I mentioned in the intro. And we're going to starting to work closely with our city and county partners to talk about some draft rules or service standards that we can bring back to your council to review later this year. We're also going to be engaging with the Regional Waste Advisory Committee on the study findings and the proposed service standards. And then we'll come back to your council here to share out results in late 2024 or early 2025. Next slide, please. And we'll leave you here with a couple of discussion questions, and we're happy to talk about the study or any other questions you might have.
Council, good morning. Sorry I was late. Questions for staff? Councilor Nolan.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I noticed on the different size of multifamily residents there was a disproportionately lower number of participants in the larger units. The 105 unit property, I think was it's 5 times bigger than the smallest one, and its participation wasn't 5 times the smaller one. Do you have any explanation for why that would be the case, or what could be done to make that participation more proportional?
Hopefully I'm answering and understanding correctly. So, for example, the smaller properties participated once or twice per month, and the largest groups participated only 3 or 4 times a month.
Right.
And I think the maximum that those, hypothetically, the large properties, there could be material out 3 times a week or more, for example, if someone has an item to set out, but there were only 4 to 5, if it's a 5-week month, points of collection, so that they only went by the property once per week. So it's possible that those large properties are participating or would participate more, but we gathered data on a weekly basis. Am I explaining that well?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure we're understanding your question.
Could you put that slide up, please?
I think one of the important factors is participation was measured based on whether something was set out when the truck arrived. So
And
if it
so-
was 10 things or 1 thing, it still would
So
have been
if I
marked
put a
as
stool out, that was 1 participation, and if I put 10 sofas out, it was 1 participation. Okay.
Yep.
Any other questions? Counselor Wong.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you for the presentation. I have 2 questions. I was just wondering, for like appliance and TVs, do those go potentially to the community warehouse, or do we, dispose of those in other ways just because it's e-waste? And I don't know, does it end up mostly going to the landfill, or what happens with that?
So for community warehouse or like any particular organization, they have a specific list of items that they receive. So I don't believe TVs are on the list of items that they would reuse at community warehouse. So for the purposes of this study, nothing actually was reused because we wanted to gather data on all of the materials that were generated. But depending on the reuse organization, there could be opportunities, but that just might not have been material that community warehouse would collect, for example.
So in the future, could there be like a potential partnership with Free Geek or an organization like that that might take electronics?
Yeah, so one of the things we did do was count the number of electronics, and it's important to keep in mind in this study, it was large electronics, so primarily those large TVs. And I think we had, I'm trying to remember exactly how many we had. I'll find that number, but we did
67.
67. Yeah, so over the 16 weeks, we collected about 67 TVs, and those were handled by each collection company in the way that they currently handle them, but they could be processed through the Free Geek or the eCycles product stewardship program.
I think the findings of the condition of the materials really has an impact on the reusability as well. I think about like a TV set out overnight in, Oregon and in an enclosure, then loaded into a flatbed truck. It's probably not going to fare very well by the time it gets to a facility where the reuse organizations could look through it or glean from it. So most of those products are probably going to get disposed of. And we have the Oregon eCycles program, which is a recycling program. So they're banned from the landfill. So they would be diverted off through there. And then appliances also would be screened for Freon or anything else like that before they were recycled. But there's some opportunity, but I think we are seeing that most of that opportunity is going to be upstream from somebody setting it out at the garbage area in their apartment complex. So either a special opportunity for reuse or a special route run by a reuse organization before the garbage haulers pick it up or something along those lines would be more effective.
Okay. Have it.
Oh, go ahead.
More. I saw in the study of a cost per ton was about $500 on the low end to $1,000. And as we think about potentially taking this to a regional scale, I think we worked with 2,400 units in multifamily. Do you have a sense of a scale of how many multifamily units there are in the region and what that might cost us? And also, I mean, do we anticipate greater like economies of scale as we scale up?
Yeah, absolutely. So the count of multifamily properties is a little over 7,000 in the region. One of the things, the cost data that we gathered for this was what it costs to operate the study itself. We do expect there's going to be variations by collection company, by jurisdiction, and how their franchise is set up. But there could be opportunity to optimize routes. So to create routing efficiencies and other sorts of efficiencies by collection company to manage that cost. Because it was a smaller scale and a limited number of properties, likely the cost is higher. As Rachel mentioned, the disposal costs were about 30% of the total cost, with the collection cost being about 70% of the total cost. So that's where that disposal cost can be more fixed. It just costs a certain amount per ton to dispose versus the operations, the types of trucks, the types of fuel, and how they decide to optimize the routes. There could be opportunity to optimize to reduce that cost.
And this is from the regional system fee? Was that the primary source that we used to fund the study?
Regional system fee, yes.
For the study.
For the study, just to operate the study.
If there was a service developed, it would be a rate-based service. So the customer, the property manager would pay for the service that they would take advantage of. And I think we looked at the numbers, we're estimating around 22,000 tons of materials if we did the math based on the out in the region. So that is a significant amount of material across the region compared to 1.8 million that we throw away. It's not that big of a piece of it, but there's also, I think we found that a lot of those costs are already being borne by the property managers. Like if someone leaves a mattress out in the enclosure, the maintenance person is taking them, or they're piling them up, or they're requesting special pickups, or they're working with other organizations to remove material off their property. So a lot of that cost, I think, is already in the system as well.
Great. Okay, thank you.
Great. Counselor Simpson.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, staff, for that presentation. And thank you. I heard Matt Miller's in the building from Gresham Sanitary.
Yes.
Tell Matt I said hello from Oz. Quick question. It was a 16-week study. A lot of my questions were answered through other questions, but do you anticipate a ramp up during holiday season, spring break, or spring cleaning, things like that? Because that $2 price point on the monthly pickup looks real attractive, and it might decrease. I mean, not during the holidays for sure, but like it may decrease year round some of that waste if we can keep the price point low as we expand it out, economies of scale and things like that. So do you all anticipate more bulky waste during those holiday periods, spring break and things like that?
I think the thing that was interesting in the results was actually, if we look that first slide that we showed with the chart of generational bulky waste, it was actually pretty stable, and that included the Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays. So that was an interesting, surprising result. Having said that, I think the results that the cost estimates that we provided do try to take into account the average across all the weeks, so including those holiday periods. And so to your point, I think to include both those low, potentially in the future, low use weeks and higher demand weeks to kind of even those out.
And as Rachel pointed out, 70% was the collection costs and 30% was the disposal costs. And so more material really impacts the disposal side of the equation more. And so the act of the truck showing up and driving by and doing the service is the most critical or most expensive element of the service. And that's consistent with other collection services. So I think it doesn't have as big of an impact as it might feel like it does.
Thank you.
Great. Counselor Nolan.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Do you have any data from the study, or can you speculate a bit about how a program like this might impact mattress return to mattress manufacturers. When a mattress gets returned to the mattress store or manufacturer, it is much, much, much more likely to be recycled. The materials reused. If it's sitting outside for overnight or a day waiting for collection, it can't be. So how could we make sure that an initiative like this, which has lots of benefits, doesn't reduce the amount of material that actually gets reused and kept out of the landfill?
So we anticipate that with the mattress EPR, later this year, that mattresses that are collected through this type of a collection service, as long as they're utilizing like a box truck or a flatbed, they're maintaining the integrity of the mattress when they collect. Those mattresses can be incorporated as a part of the mattress EPR. So those still can be collected.
And if they're sopping wet?
I believe they could be recycled, but they wouldn't be reused.
Good. Well, that's good news. Second question, if I might. Did you gather any evidence in the study about whether the participation rates can, or maybe more so from literature reviews of other locations that have this, does participation improve with longevity of a program? 4 months may, if I don't have a mattress to dispose of, then I didn't participate. But so that's that question. Or is there something we can do to collaborate with property managers, either educate them or set requirements for them to make sure that their property is synced up time-wise with the collection so that we can improve participation?
Definitely. So through the single family program interviews, one thing that was found is that pretty much across the board, the longer standing programs that were, for example, at least 10 years old had the highest participation rates. And the newer programs around 4 or 5 years had the lower participation rates. So it did kind of follow that trend. Through the, with regard to property managers, we found through the study that being really engaged with property managers, they wanted it to be successful as well. They wanted residents to know to place items in the right location and know when to place items out so that they don't place items out on Monday when the pickup happened on Sunday. So they wanted to be really dialed in so that they could communicate to their residents when to place items out, where to place items. Because if it goes in the wrong location, they have to coordinate with their maintenance team, get items moved around. So the impression that I had from those conversations was resident awareness and education was really important. I think we heard the same thing through the single family interviews, that was an area that jurisdictions really wanted to keep boosting up, is making sure folks know about the service.
That makes intuitive sense, and I'm glad that it's backed up by the information you have. Good. Very promising.
I guess I have some questions, and I apologize if you talked about this before I came in. So having grown up in a university town, I'm very used to bulky waste pickup. Move in dates, move out dates. Big days in Madison, Wisconsin. It was a big day.
Eugene was the same way. So.
Yeah, exactly. Now take that by 3 times the population. Yeah. The question I have is, so this program, this pilot program, is, just tell me if I'm correct, is to affect conversations with the cities and counties who have the contracts with the haulers to be able to say, this is an important thing to put into your contract when you are renegotiating or when you are putting out for bid.
Yeah, essentially, exactly. We've been working with the cities and counties all the time, and in our code and administrative rules, we have what we call regional service standards, and that kind of sets the floor for the types of services that are offered in the region. And so the exploration going into phase 4 is discussing those regional service standards and talking about setting a new service standard or a new floor for bulky waste collection services. Say at the minimum, we should have these types of things in all of the jurisdictions in the region, and that will result in program implementation coming up through the local governments through either their rulemakings or their franchise agreements.
Thank you. And we have heard from the cities and counties that they want this, they just didn't know how to do it. We initiated this and we are working with them to
Both. It's an action that's discreetly called out in the regional waste plan. So action 10 or action 10.5, I think, in the regional waste plan talks about bulky waste collection services. So we've kind of been moving through an evolution of multifamily service improvements. A couple of years ago, we did the regional service standards that have like a minimum service level for recycling and garbage service. And the next step was bulky waste in that kind of spectrum. So we already have rules that say we need to have regularly occurring service by July 25, which is coming up really quick. And we might need to adjust that date if we're just going to be adopting rules in 25. But that's kind of the glide path to kind of improving services in the multifamily sector. So we're working together with them and we're kind of working through the conversation to make sure we can come together to.
So this is
Find
not a
solutions.
surprise to
No,
that conversation. And then what's the form for that? Because we just adopted a new RWAC makeup. And there was a request that we have more city and county representation on there. Is that where you've been having this discussion, or is it been with staff? Like, is it elected levels talking about it, or is it?
most
Staff.
of it has been at the staff level. We have a staff work group that has been about 2 years in working together with local governments. And then now we're moving the policy conversation to what we have a table called the policy table, which is really the managers and directors of the solid waste programs at local governments. And we will be engaging with RWAC, and that's where we would capture more of that. But the elected officials have been kind of informed along the way with some updates and email blasts we sent out. We had a mailing list that was going out through the first phases, so it shouldn't be a surprise to folks. And we're working together with them to hopefully come up with a common solution. Then we can have a coordinated solution. That's the goal.
Okay, it's just an interesting application of the conversation we're having around the fact that RWAC is a chartered committee, just like MPAC and JPAC, and the cities and counties have certain expectations about how JPAC and MPAC work, where there is a conversation happening, a policy direction, then it goes to the technical committee to make it work, and then it comes back for conversation and adoption. And so I know that just in the back of my mind, standardization is not always a good thing. You just can't assume that like having standard protocols for everything. You got to be a little bit flexible because this is a little different than the other two topics. But I guess I'm just saying out loud, I think there's expectations about how we have these conversations in the future. And I just am trying to get a better understanding of, I think we've been doing a good job, so don't take anything bad away, but like, how do we formalize how we get to these things in that context, so that everybody's expectations are being met and it's no surprises and plenty of opportunity for input. So,
Absolutely. Thanks.
yeah, Counselor Wong.
Thank you, Madam President. And just a quick follow-up on that line of questioning for my own education. Is there a difference between, for our agency, administrative rulemaking and an ordinance? Is that
Yes.
the rulemaking is just something that you or Marisa kind of clarifies in our code, or?
Yeah, so administrative rules are like the implementation tool for a code change or ordinance. So my understanding of this project, the code that authorizes it was adopted in 2020 with some updates to the service standards. And then that was put into administrative rule. So an administrative rule process technically is a COO approved process, and it goes through a public comment period and things like that. But we would be definitely coming back to council to make sure that folks are up to date on it.
So
I love this line of questioning. Just getting at the authority of the council versus the COO and administrative rules. So again, this is going back to our beginnings where we are based on literally by the person who wrote the ballot measure, a governor and legislature model at the local level. Sorry, just a little tilt of the head.
Yeah, Council President Peterson and, members of the council. So Metro is a city manager form of government, which means typically that the administrative and executive functions are delegated to the are delegated to the COO. In this case, in chapter 5 of the code, their explicit delegation, I believe, and I'm gonna see if my phone lights up, but my recollection from the code is that that delegates the authority for the COO to adopt administrative rules after a public comment process, as has been described, consistent with the policy direction in the code. There are some places, and sometimes it's required by function of statute. So for example, the council sitting as the contract review board actually adopts our procurement rules. So there are times where council actually adopts the administrative rules. Typically that's done where state law has that requirement. Otherwise, it's done by the COO through a delegation that council gives when they adopt particular code chapters. So this is a little bit of a circumstance where, generally speaking, I'm going to say in our construct, the COO would be adopting administrative rules after a public comment period pursuant to policy already established by council. In some cases, council will actually do the adoption of the administrative rules. And to the best of my knowledge, scanning right now, that is around our contracting, procurement, our CET. There's some other areas as well.
Thank you.
So just to clarify, when you're creating the rules, it actually just goes to the COO and doesn't come back.
Well, we are planning to come back to you all and share with you our rule concepts so that we're not just going in there without your advice and consent.
Okay, thanks for clarifying.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for the clarification too.
Yeah.
Any other? All right, seeing none online or in person, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good work getting to this point and the continued work to make this an available service for everybody. I know that former Councilor Craddock would be so happy to be here at this meeting today. All
Thanks for your
right.
time.
Thank you. All right, we'll move on to the next agenda item, which is the 2025 state legislative. We're doing transportation first, transportation priorities. Councilors, as you know, this 2025 legislative session, the legislature will be looking back on to what more they need to do in transportation. And there is the consideration of a transportation package. It's not a very long session, so we have to be really key and concise about what we're trying to accomplish. And we've got both Catherine Charlo and Annalisa Curler. And there's one piece of information I just wanted to get out. It was in the back of my mind and I don't want to forget. I think that this transportation conversation could go several different ways. But I think a good sign is that the House Majority Leader and the Senate Speaker have put out for hire a project manager to be shared between the two. Knowing that this is of import to the state and that it's complicated and it's going to take a lot of heavy lifting. So I think it's great that they're out there looking for somebody to manage this through to a successful completion. So I am buoyed by that fact. And I will turn it over to one of you.
You want me to start? Okay. Good morning, councilors. My name is Annalisa Curler and I am your Legislative Affairs Manager.
And I am Catherine Charlo, use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Director of the Planning, Development, and Research Department.
And there's a party happening outside.
They're having bulky waste conversations out there.
It's a bulky waste party.
Yes. I like to think we're having a party in here too. To talk about transportation and a possible state transportation package. If you can advance to the next slide, please. So our agenda for today's presentation, we're first going to go over the council priority setting process. Really, our goal for today is to make sure you understand how we plan to set council's priorities for a transportation package, how that interacts with your legislative agenda, how that interacts with the JPAC process, and get any feedback to tweak that process. We are also going to do some table setting about the transportation package and what we're hearing from legislative leadership, what we're hearing from the governor and the politics of the hour. And then Catherine is going to do a overview of state and local government fiscal cliffs. Next slide, please. So when staff thought about how to develop a process for setting your transportation priorities for a possible package, we were really guided by two main pieces. The first piece of that is, and I'm sure you're aware of this, is that transportation packages at the state level come around about once a decade, once every 10 years or so. They're a really big deal. They are substantial, they are sizable, they're significant. And so in light of that, we've kind of pulled out the transportation legislative agenda from our normal legislative agenda process, knowing how significant it is to the state, how significant a package is to our region, and how important transportation is to you all. We have developed a process that will run alongside our legislative agenda process that really highlights, I hope, the significance of it. And then the other piece that really guided our decision in the draft that we brought before you was knowing that we are most successful down in Salem when we are united as a region. And so we have developed a process that pulls, that really runs a lot of this process through JPACT, through our regional partners, making sure that when we go down to Salem, we are all speaking from the same songbook, that the legislature feels like, I saw that. As much as we can speak from the same songbook, Counselor.
We sing from the same hymn.
That we are primarily united and all representing what we both want. We know we are most successful if we come in with a targeted list, a strategic list, and we're all asking for the same things. Next slide. So there's a lot on this slide, but this was my attempt at putting together a graphic that really demonstrated the multitude of processes that we're running simultaneously. So first up is JPACT. So JPACT has actually already kicked off this process. So since January, they have been having information sessions at nearly every JPACT meeting. And this is really to ground JPACT in the transportation conversations that are happening. So these have been things like ODOT going over its fiscal cliff, our local government partners describing their fiscal cliffs, talking to folks from other states about how they fund transportation, talking about transit, all of those things to put JPACT in a place where they can then discuss possible draft priorities. This Thursday, they will begin that discussion based off of a draft of staff. This is actually in your packet for today and will be something that you will be discussing next week. We will be refining, staff will be refining those draft priorities and bringing them back to discussion in September and October for JPACT for a final adoption, hopefully in November. So concurrent to that is council's own process for setting your transportation agendas. So we have really tried to condense the education that JPACT is getting and bringing that to you today and next week in work sessions. And then you will be also discussing next week the draft priorities that staff has put together. And then we will be before you again in September and October prior to JPACT meetings for you all to discuss the refined draft. So it is, along that framework of really wanting to be united as a region, it is our hope that JPACT's priorities very much mirror council priorities. And that they are hopefully as close to as possible as one and the same. And we have developed a process that we hope will help facilitate that. And then the final piece is your own legislative agenda. And I'm going to be right back up before you right after this presentation, Jenna, and I will be to talk about that. But that is also running concurrently. We have just pulled the transportation piece out of that, but that will be following its normal cadence. We will be before you multiple times for discussion and talking about your priorities with the aim to have final adoption of your legislative agenda in December. And our hope is that the transportation priorities will be folded into that. So I'm going to pause here because that was a lot of information. Are there any questions about this slide, this process?
Thanks, Madam Chair. At what point do we talk about the scale of the package?
I think you can.
And since ODOT has talked about its funding cliff, I don't think shaking people's pockets out for loose change will satisfy the funding. Are we having conversations about viable additional revenue sources?
Yes, we are. And I think, for example, next week, we're actually hoping to have someone come talk to you about how other states fund revenue or fund transportation, what other revenue sources they have, and utilize. And I think that that is a key part of the discussion. And I think we've also talked to our local government partners about them scoping their need, now that ODOT has scoped what the need is, and talking about other, transit as well. So I think all of that is on the table. And we should make sure that we know what you would like the size and scope to be of the transportation package.
And as we think of that, Madam Chair, I would appreciate a chance for the council to weigh in on what we want a transportation package to deliver. And that could be measured in, congestion and how do we want to define congestion. It could be measured in proximity between residents and workplace, and that becomes both a transportation and land use issue. It could be defined in terms of modal split. But I think it would be helpful for this council to spend some time on that so that JPAC has, so that we're more likely to really sync up and not just react to JPAC, but it's a iterative process with JPAC.
I'm having multiple vague and conflicting thoughts in my head, so I'm gonna tear them apart. But one of them is at a very high level, and then I'm gonna come down. One of the conversations that I really want this council to have is our strategic goals conversation that we started that needs to be finished, and morphing that with targeted universalism, which sets universal goals. We at Metro have said that we are implementing targeted universalism, but we've actually not set universal goals. Within the different departments, we have set some goals, but we've never talked about it as agency-wide. And so I think big picture, that's kind of a North Star to start thinking about in terms of especially the 2040 to 2070 work. What are we trying to achieve on behalf of everybody in this region? So that's global. Then coming down to next level, I would say we just adopted the RTP, which is a 20-year plan. And there's probably some embedded things in there that are guideposts. And then coming back down even further, there's some principles that the governor has put out in her office on transportation. There's some principles that I know JPAC has been talking about, and they go like this, and they're not going to be rocket science. You've heard them before in many other different positions you've been in, but starting with fix it first, right? We always start with fix it first, which is an amazing place for the state, because in this nation, that's not where most states start. So like being able to get those principles, and I think that's hopefully where we're headed with this conversation, is the principles first. And then I would say, let's go back to the RTP and make sure that we're being able to articulate what does that mean, fix it first for this region, for example. So yes, I agree. I just want to lay out all that came into my head as you spoke. And we may not get to exactly where you want to go because of the fact that.
Well, and there's the hitch.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. If we wait until we have the perfect universe
perfect.
defined,
Yeah.
then we will miss this once in a decade opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
So having an initial framework for that, and then having council discussion about, well, what does fix it first mean?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Transit system is not delivering what the region needs. So would fix it first include adding enough transit service to fix the gap, or is fixing it only repaving or changing the tracks on the steel bridge so that
Or
the
dealing
MAX
with the
line can
safety,
run across
or
it
dealing with the
faster
safety.
than I can walk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I think good point. And I think we can take off after we have the principles.
Lots to talk about. I appreciate it.
Yeah, because I
love the way
would
you're
love to
taking
have a
it.
forum to talk about hardening the TriMet system to provide for safety. what is that?
Right.
Who initiates that? Right? Anyway, so I'll turn it back to you, but I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
we just had a whole thing around you, so you can just.
I like it. No, it was great. It was great. Next slide, please. So moving on into the transportation package framing, there are a couple of high level pieces that I want to highlight here. So first of all, you know, these are once in a decade funding packages that pass in the legislature. And in this case, very much the framing around this and the impetus for this one, despite the, I think it's been about 8 years since the last one passed, is this funding cliff for ODOT and local jurisdictions. So I think you all well know that Catherine's going to go into more detail on this at the end of the presentation, but gas taxes declining, electric vehicles, more fuel efficient vehicles, we have quite the funding cliff that our transportation agencies are all approaching. And that is very much the impetus for this transportation package. The other two pieces to make sure that you understand is just a reminder that tax increases require a 3/5 vote in the legislature. Traditionally, transportation packages are bipartisan. I think that's in part because of the 3/5 vote requirement, but it is also because traditionally transportation is an area in which both Republicans and Democrats come to the table and agree needs to be funded. So staff will be approaching this like this package will be bipartisan, and we anticipate that it will be. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen in November. It's possible that a party could get to that 3/5 threshold, but it is likely that this will be a bipartisan package. Second, the other piece to remember is that this could always be referred to voters, and that is the giant elephant that is in the room in negotiations around a package of this size. And it often serves to limit the size of the package and to dictate what is included in the package. So just another piece to make sure that you all are aware of. Next slide, please. As staff is thinking about some of the challenges in regards to this transportation package, just a few things to make sure you are aware of. First, as I think you all know, this is, you know, transportation is not a top tier issue for voters. It is important to them, but when they are, you know, forced to talk about what is top of mind, things like behavioral health, homelessness, housing, public safety, education tend to be top of mind, and transportation is a little bit lower on that list. What that means for this package is that, you know, it's already a tough vote for legislators to make when they have to make a tax increase vote. It is even tougher when it is for an issue that is maybe not top of mind for voters. I will also say that, you know, public sentiment around transportation right now and taxes, I think, is that folks feel like they already pay for it and it should just be provided. They pay a gas tax, they pay a vehicle reg fee, and these are basic services that government should just be providing and already ought to provide. So again, you know, when legislators are at the door, they're not hearing so much about transportation. In addition, you know, when legislators are thinking about taking a tax increase, it matters who the money's going to. And in this case, it, you know, will likely be going to transportation agencies like ODOT and our local government partners. I think, you know, the ODOT's rolling out of tolling and frankly, you know, some of their service delivery as a result of the impending fiscal cliff have made some legislators a little bit more leery of ODOT and its ability as an agency to deliver. And that's going to factor into the discussions on the transportation package. Similarly, House Bill 2017 authorized a number of very large projects in our region, some of which have not crossed the finish line or even approached the finish line. There is a perception from some legislators that our region is the reason for the delay or the cost increase. And, you know, things are difficult to get done in the Portland metro region for large transportation projects. And that is going to be a challenge. We are working as a region to push back on that, but just to be aware of in the conversations around the package. And then finally, the ever-present issue is that there is a multitude of needs across the system, whether that's at the state level or the local level, whether that's the roadway, transit, bike, ped. There are many, many needs, and we don't have enough money. We know we will not have enough money to fund all of it. And so there will be a prioritization process that will unfold as a result, and it will definitely be a challenging conversation. Next slide. In terms of the real opportunities that are before us, as I mentioned, this this package is being framed around the fiscal cliff and the need to really switch to a sustainable funding source. And that, I think, is the real opportunity that is before us. I think that we will look back, and if this package passes, we will see this as, you know, either the real first step in a process to switching to a sustainable funding source, or actually switching to that sustainable funding source. Is very much the focus of the legislature, the focus of the governor. How do we figure out this switch? And it is a real opportunity in front of us, and one that I think a lot of us are really excited about. In addition, I would say, you know, we've been very successful when we work together as a region, down in Salem and on transportation in particular. And so there's a real opportunity there that if we show up united, we can get what we need as a region. Next slide, please. So in terms of the early themes that we are hearing, so this is what we're hearing from the governor's office, from legislative leadership, from transportation leadership. Metro Council President alluded to this earlier. It is very much this idea of getting back to basics. How are we funding the operation and maintenance of our transportation system, both at the state level and at the local level? There is a real focus on safety, on transit, and finishing off those large mega projects in our region from House Bill 2017. We have very much heard that this is not a package that is meant to fund projects. It is meant to fund programs. It is meant to be funding mechanisms. It is not the traditional Christmas tree list of with all the little shiny ornaments. You know, with all the different projects, we will see if that turns out to be true in you know, at the end of the day. But as of now, that is very much what we are hearing from leadership across the board. Next slide. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about what's changed since the last time we talked about this with you all in January. And Metro Council President also alluded to this. We are really seeing leadership, whether that's the governor's office, the Senate president, the speaker at the legislative level, really commit to a 2025 package. Back in January, we did not have that stated commitment. We were not seeing that that desire necessarily. I think it was actually there. We just weren't hearing about it yet. And things like the staff position that you alluded to, I think all indicate that we are seeing leadership on board. I want to be clear, that doesn't mean there's going to for sure be a 2025 package, but it is a really good sign and an indication that it will be a top priority for session. And that's really important. And the other major thing that you all are, I believe, aware of that's changed is our MPP is not moving forward. So there's been some changes in our tolling programs, and 205 Abernathy tolling has been paused. Yes.
You've mentioned the governor, Senate president, and speaker. Do we have commitment to producing a package from the minority leaders?
That's a good question. I have not seen that yet, so I will double check, but I don't believe so. Yeah.
We will almost certainly need
correct
bipartisan votes in both chambers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Next slide, please. So I wanted to make sure you are aware of the process that the state is undertaking in anticipation of this package, similar to the last transportation package and other large-scale funding bills. The state has embarked and will continue to embark on a roadshow. So they are traveling throughout the state, spending time in different communities, talking about transportation, hearing from local elected key stakeholders, community groups about the transportation needs of their communities. They kicked it off at the beginning of June in our region, and they will end at the end of September in our region. And typically those roadshows serve as a way to hear from the entire state about the transportation needs, and also really help ground the discussion that the legislature will have. The co-chairs have also put forth tentative work groups. So this very much models the process that they undertook for House Bill 2017, where they had work groups that dived into different components of the package. These are, again, they are tentative, but this is what the co-chairs currently think would be the types of work groups that that they would pull together. They will likely kick off during session. And I hope you look at that list and see a number of priorities or important things that you want to make sure the package contains. Next slide. So before I turn it over to Catherine, I just want to leave you with a couple of key takeaways. So very excited to have legislative leadership, transportation leadership, governor on board. But remember that, you know, a package is not guaranteed. And those are votes that that each member of the legislature will have to decide to take, and it is not an easy vote for them to take. So it's going to take a lot of work to get there, and we will have to build the legislative support for it. The other piece, money keeps us together, projects pull us apart. So again, this idea that we are funding mechanisms, we are funding programs, and whether that is here at a region or at the state level, starting to get into that prioritization of projects starts to be where the coalition falls apart and we struggle to get things across the finish line. And then the last piece, and this again gets to many of the themes we talked about today, supporting the sustainability of the transportation system is not flashy, but it is incredibly critical. And that definitely is going to be the focus of the legislature. And we need to help figure out a way to help see this all across the finish line. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Catherine.
Thank you, Annalisa, for the table setting. Next slide, please. I am going to talk at a pretty high level about the conversations we've had at JPAC over the past 6 months, where we try to put some meat on the bones of what Annalise just described. Next slide, please. So before I do that, I'm gonna just reground us in what your role is in this process, you being council. Obviously, Metro is the MPO for the region. We have established the priorities and policy through the regional transportation plan. You approve implementation decisions, but you also weigh in on major moves like this, where we are thinking about the types of things that really will help make that regional transportation plan and the policies you said were a priority, help bring them into reality. So next slide, please. I want to just spend a minute talking about the state fiscal cliff. I am guessing that you have heard a lot about this. I'm not going to go into detail. Happy to answer questions to the extent that I can. But fundamentally, what you see is it has already started to diverge what the needs and the current gas tax funding scenario look like. And as we move forward from 2024, fundamentally, the gas tax is not keeping up. And there's a lot of reasons. Annalisa talked about some of those reasons, inflation, increasing fuel efficiency, and the fact that the gas tax just isn't raised very often. Next slide, please. So in addition to ODOT's fiscal cliff, we are seeing direct effects from that on our cities and counties, and we're also seeing a parallel reduction for the same reasons I just described in the city and county's own sources. So just wanted to sketch this out for you all to look at. As it shows, local transportation funding comes from a few sources: the state highway fund distribution, and that gives 30% of those gas tax receipts to the counties and 20% to the cities. The 50% that goes to ODOT is spent on the state system, but that does not mean that it doesn't get spent in our region. And it doesn't mean that a shortfall in that 50% doesn't impact us. It does for sure. We also do have some local sources: gas taxes, vehicle registration fees, property tax levies, and other mechanisms. We also apply for federal grants. It is crucial to note, however, that those local sources are also not keeping up for many of the same reasons. So we sort of have this layered situation of fiscal cliff at the city and county level. Next slide, please. Just want to make sure that when we describe a shortfall in operations and maintenance funding at the local level, that we understand that it's not just a shortfall in paving or striping or maintenance, although those things are true, but it ends up being a significant impact on a lot of the things that, going back to our regional transportation plan, are really part and parcel of Metro's vision for this plan. So just a couple of examples. not only can the city of Portland not keep up with maintenance and paving improvements for roadways, but there's real problems for transit priority for the signal improvements. There's problems maintaining them and providing that kind of improvement. Invisible, but very meaningful for actually providing better transit service. Similarly, that type of maintenance shortfall either creates poor conditions for walking and bicycling or depresses the willingness or ability of the city or counties to put in specialized infrastructure that needs extra maintenance, and there's extra cost for that. So they, again, look invisible, but they become very important for some of the basic safety needs that we're trying to promote and accomplish for our system. Another example, Clackamas County has been unable to fund complete streets, sidewalks, bike lanes, multimodal improvements because of shortfalls, budget shortfalls. Multnomah County, 47% of the roads, of the county's roads, are in a fairly serious state of disrepair requiring replacement. So you start to see the depth of the problem. Next slide, please. Just to go back and pick up on what you all, I actually think Council President Peterson and Councilor Nolan, that you guys framed up this list really well. To go back to what Annalise was saying and what you all were talking about, what we're hearing is that this back to basics, or this sort of crucial conversation about how we meet core needs, is what's going to underlie the regional coherence of priorities for the region, for the package. It's also consistent with what we're hearing at the state level, which at this point is important. To be out of step with the legislative leadership at this point is not a place we'd want to be moving forward. And then I also want to mention the fix it first theme. While it's not in actual words here, you see that emerging very much from what's on this slide. So as we've gone through the description of the local and the state fiscal cliff that I just described, this is the set of priorities that JPACT is loosely landing on. There's a draft of those in your packet. You all are going to talk about it more next week. As Annalise mentioned, JPACT is going to talk about it more on Thursday, but really trying to focus on, first and foremost, sustainable funding mechanisms. For all the reasons we were just talking about, if we don't deal with that, we are going to have a failed package and that doesn't provide a set of solutions either now or in the future. This focus on increasing operations and maintenance funding, not just for the state, although that is critical, but also for cities and counties. There's a lot of focus on that in different conversations, and in that opportunities that Annalisa showed us, I think there's a lot of ways and places to weigh in on the critical nature of both. Certainly focusing on maintaining our ability as local jurisdictions to raise revenue. At the same time, making sure there isn't a misunderstanding that substitute the revenue that comes from the state gas tax. Those two things are both important, but they don't cancel one another out. And then, as you all also mentioned, the funding of transit, critical to the RTP, critical to the vibrancy and economic resilience of our community.
Slide, please. So that gets us to next steps. This is essentially a very summarized version of the pretty chart that Annalisa showed. Our JPAC meeting to discuss the draft priorities is Thursday. You all have another work session coming next week to talk about those priorities, and feel free to ask us questions today. We'll try to answer them. If we need to bring answers back to you, then we will. And then in September, we'll bring before you a refined draft of the priorities, and hopefully by October, we'll be ready to sync up JPACs in your thinking and final approval and agreement on those priorities. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Council President Peterson, and Annalise probably the wrap up.
So Counselors, this was the first of, as I mentioned a number of times, we will be before you to talk about your priorities for a council package. And I think wanted to center the discussion, first on just any feedback on the process that we have laid it out. Is there anything in there that you would like changed or things you would like to emphasize, things you would make sure the staff is aware of? And then as we're thinking about, this process to develop our priorities, are there any additional topics or presentations that you would like to see as you're thinking about what your priorities might be? Catherine just talked about the fiscal cliff at a very high level for both our local government partners and state partners. Next week, we're gonna have TriMet here to talk about transit, and we're also going to have someone here to talk about how other states fund transportation. So really getting at what is that sustainable funding source and ideas around that. But we'll be very curious to hear if there's additional feedback about other topics or presentations that would be helpful to you.
And your point of this maybe be the beginning of a conversation, what we see in this session, maybe a step towards maybe a larger conversation. Of course, we started the conversation in 2015 last time and it ended in 2017. Prior to that, I think we can pretty much look at that same trend happening over and over again. So level setting expectations. I would start with Councilor Gonzalez and Lewis instead of Sen, just because they're on JPAC. This is you're the only one here sitting on JPAC today, so if you want to keep us out, that'd be great.
Yes, yeah, thank you so much, Annalise and Catherine, for your presentation. It's a lot of regurgitated for myself, so I'm glad that the rest of the council had an opportunity to get this information. I really want to stress the big piece about that Annalise rose, and that is projects will sink us. And I think we had a really good exercise at one JPAC where we started to, how we crafted this list is we asked the group, what are things that outcomes that you want to see? And I'll give a great example. It was first and last mile access to transit. Right. And that's something that like doesn't specifically point out a project, but could be a program for getting things done. Another one was that was brought up was around safety and safe routes to school, making sure our kiddos can get to and from school by foot, considering that if you live within a mile of your school, you don't have busing services, so you have no choice but to walk. So I'm really happy with the direction, looking forward to more robust conversations with this council, JPAC, the OTC and others. But I'm really here to make sure that the voices here on this council and the guidance from this council is also shared through at JPAC and with the rest of the JPAC counselors. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Madam Chair. First, the question is information. Is anyone, including the transportation engineer among us, aware of these states that use a percentage tax for their gas tax instead of a per gallon? Percentage of what? Percentage of the cost, the sale of a vehicle. No, gas tax. The reason I'm interested in that is that that's added. The public tolerates increases in the pump price. And at the moment, the transportation system gets none of that because we are on a per gallon basis. If instead, gas taxes, which I understand are not long-term sustainable, but still, in general, it was imposed as a percentage of the sale. It could benefit, I mean, then inflation wouldn't be a factor. There'd be other issues, but it's something I'm wondering about.
Do you know the answer to that?
I say no.
I would say
No
I
other
don't,
state,
I
no.
don't know the answer to that. I will, we can look into it.
Yes.
I know that there are a number of states that do some sort of inflation CPI piece. And I also know that a lot of states do fund their transportation through a sales tax, which is essentially what you are describing. But I don't know if that's a general sales tax or one specific to gas. So let me look into that and get
I'm
back to you.
pretty sure Oregon was the first state to impose motor vehicle taxes. So we could become the first state to modernize them.
Gas tax. We were the first to have a gas tax.
Yes.
Thank you.
But-
One thing I might add just quickly there is, as Annalisa mentioned, some states do index the gas tax, and that has been kicked around quite a bit as a key strategy here. Even if we are moving incrementally to another source, that has been mentioned many, many times as an important way to just try to do a little bit of catch up as we move that way.
And if I might continue that line, Councillor Simpson reminded us that projects tear us apart. I don't see anything in this presentation that talks about what the options might be. And viable was a term I used earlier in the conversation. What the viable options for a substitute sustainable source of funding are. Because if money brings us together, it seems to me that we should be talking around the JPAC table and around this table about what could be sold either to the legislature or, I mean, hopefully to the legislature, because I think it's the legislature's job to raise the revenue to meet needs, but could also be sold to the public if it ends up getting referred. What discussion is there about what those other sources are?
Yeah, I think there's actually really robust discussion about what those other sources are. And I think you'll hear a little bit more about that at next week's informational presentation, where we have someone coming to kind of talk about what other states do. But what I know has been on the topic for discussion here in Oregon, first, what Catherine mentioned, indexing gas tax or current mechanisms that fund transportation, some way to keep up with inflation is definitely on the table. That is not the switch, that is just maintaining our current system. And to be clear, I think plussing up all of the current sources of funding that fund transportation, vehicle reg, gas tax, privilege tax, the payroll tax for transit, like all of those are all on the table. But when you're really talking about switching to that sustainable funding source, VMT, road user fee, is definitely on the table for discussion. Folks have also talked about a gas tax is charging the fuel. So what if you are similarly charging electricity, the other fuel source, so to speak, for electric cars as a way to get at funding transportation. Folks have also had discussions about, I think it was Minnesota who recently passed a large scale transportation package, and they had a local delivery fee component. So for, I'm going to get this a little bit wrong, but for orders over a certain size, say $100, there was a $2 fee tacked on for like your Amazon, your food delivery, those types of things. So how are we capturing that piece is another thing that I've heard folks talk about. I am sure there will be discussion about sales tax just because so many other states do fund that. Councilor Nolan, you are well aware of how sales tax often, how that conversation often goes in the legislature. So I don't know if that is as promising of a solution, but I am sure that will be looked at as well. And then to be clear, I think there are.
You mean, or on the fuel?
I think just in general, but yeah. But yes,
sales tax on general purchases to fund transportation.
So in most states, it's used for transit. Let's be clear. In most states, the general sales tax is used for education and transit, not necessarily in vehicle stuff, because there are other ways, right, to pay for that. But there are probably some states who use a general fund sales tax to pay for transportation, but the majority of them are using it in transit.
And a VMT would get to the issue of it's independent of the source of the fuel. So is there consideration of essentially a weight mile tax on private vehicles? Because
Yes.
Tesla tank, have you seen The Tesla tanks around town?
Cybertruck?
Yes. Weighs a little more than
Sure.
Fiat 500.
Yes.
Um,
No, I think Weight Mile will definitely also be
Okay.
on the table
Good.
for
some good options.
for a discussion. And if if there are other ideas, I think the state is very much looking for ideas right now. So let us know.
And they
And I
are
think-
thinking about implementation over time, how you move toward I like the word plus up some of the sources now and think about how you could then make a case for shifting to other sources over time.
That was just what I was gonna put an emphasis on, because we have money, we have bonded against gas tax or vehicle registration fees.
Right.
And so you can't just change the underlying source of paying off those bonds. So it does take time. So the transition will have to be planned out. Any other questions? Yes, Counselor Wong.
Yes, thank you, Madam President. I'm just wondering what the staff advice on how we should think about, this measure. Is it really just focusing on the new revenue source? And that's how we should approach it? Because I think when we speak more with our constituents, I hear a lot about transit and safety. So I think there is something that maybe not necessarily specific projects like, this project on this street, but like it's really these bigger buckets of, safety, accessibility, improving transit, those types of things. So yeah, what would be your recommendation in speaking to constituents about how we and they should think about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think you want to talk about both of those things, the two sides of the coin. Like, I think, for prior transportation packages, the revenue source has not been as much of a subject of discussion. But for this one, it will be. And there's a real opportunity there. But in addition, equally as important is what is that money going to fund? And that is, I think, not wanting to get out ahead of council, but I imagine things like safety and transit, and making sure that the basics of the systems, the sidewalks, all of that is there. All of those things are important, and we need to make sure that the package is prioritizing using this new revenue to fund those things. So to me, it's talking about both and the opportunity to address both.
It seems like there's a question of like ambition versus what we can pay for, right? That's people want us to make ambitious changes. But we need the funding source to kind of back that up. But people don't get excited about funding sources, but they do get excited about kind of the work that could be done. So and that's kind of what we're hearing from the statewide tour too, is like people are really focused on investments and improvements.
Yes.
Yeah.
And maybe you'll hear a little bit of this from our presenter next week, from Tea for America. But one of the things she talked about with JPACT was how difficult it is to sell that basic operations and maintenance for reasons that Annalisa mentioned. That feels to people like they've already paid for it and it's not new. But how important it is to tell the story of what that funding does for people's everyday lives in terms of safety improvements, in terms of transit priority. So I think really for this council and JPAC to refine the message on how important this package is, and even the back to basics piece of it, how important it is to people's everyday lives and the quality of their lives is going to be super important. And the reiteration of how important transit is to this region and to the state.
In the other jurisdictions, is there like an organized campaign to tell that story with, who's the messenger and who pays for that kind of, narrative shift?
That's a really good question. I think for some jurisdictions, they are starting to really think about that and then how to get that message out there. I think for some jurisdictions, they've already started to do that work. I think ODOT has certainly started to do that work in a really clear way. So I think it just kind of depends on the jurisdiction, but yes, I think there is work underway to try to get that messaging out there.
do we have a strategy internally as Metro?
I think this is the beginning of that strategy, is to make sure we understand what you all as council support, what your alignment internally and with JPACT is. But it's a great question for us to be thinking about, and we'll come back with an answer. So thank you for the question.
I guess part of the answer to that is that Counselor Gonzalez and I and staff meet once a week on transportation. And I think the strategy so far has been to gather information and start building a coalition. Because whatever happens, we're going to need to make sure that there's a broad coalition. So I think that the question I think you're getting to is, at the time that we need it, will we have people there that will go and be able to articulate a message? And one, will we have a message? Two, will they be there to articulate it on our behalf? And I think that that's really an important part of where we're headed, in order to be speaking with one voice from the region. So yeah, agreed. I guess just to finalize this out, I know you had your hand raised, Counselor Nolan. Did you have more questions?
I do. And maybe you'll be capturing it, but I would like to put out that as a principle, I prefer to have a transportation funding system that is usage-based, because it has benefits of being something that individuals can control. And it likely has some benefits around climate, because if it is usage-based and people can control, they might be incentivized to use less. And finally, I think it supports a capacity to do some subsidy maybe, or discount or something for low-income people. But I particularly would hope that the council would join me in objecting to anything that goes to taking the precedent of general fund commitments to transportation projects as a general fund, so as a source for transportation packages. I think that's a really bad precedent, and something that we should not support.
Thank you.
Thanks. I just wanted to round it out with the three things that I've been saying, I think are important to me at the principles level. Is fix it first, finish what we started, because the bigger projects in this region weren't set up for the bigger, broader conversation that needed to happen, that now has happened, and we have a better understanding of the lay of the land of those projects and what they actually cost. Because 10 years ago, when cost estimates were done, it was done in a very narrow vacuum of information. And so it's not on the region. It's on the early cost estimation by ODOT and some of their processes. I want to make that very clear. And normally, those cost estimates would be updated based on information after going through community engagement. And they were very low to begin with, and they weren't even done in the proper way the first time, because they were not inflated to the year of actual construction. So the numbers were low, and people had a perception that they were going to be easier projects than they really were. So I want to clear the record that this region has done everything that a normal large urban area would need to do a major project in the most constrained environment in the entire part of the region. And that is especially in the Rose Corridor, or Abernathy, talking about a new transportation funding to do projects. So I think we have done everything in this region to make sure that we are pushing forward for the project, but also to make sure that the system is still working. And one project isn't prioritizing one traveler over all of other travelers. So finishing what we started. And then the third one to me is, we are in a housing crisis. Everything we do at Metro right now is about our housing crisis. And I do not think that this conversation should be any different, and that we should be making sure that for everything that we do, that we are providing the cities and the counties the opportunity to be able to get projects, literally homes built. And so to me, this is what we do at Metro. It is about land use and transportation. Land use is what we're trying to serve with transportation. Transportation itself is not the end goal. The project is not the end goal, the outcomes. So if we're going to have outcomes, I want to talk about how many more housing units will be built based on the types of programs and money invested. Just looking at the Rose Corridor and the things that will result from that investment is huge in terms of the number of housing units. We can talk about that. And the other things that be examples that would go into programs like 82nd TV Highway. There are actual housing starts that can result from that. And we have seen that time and time again in transportation, that our projects then spur the development because the cities and counties do not have the money. Growth is not paying its own way. It can never pay its own way, or we end up in a housing crisis. So I think we just need to be realistic and push on that. And I also think that that's one way to engage the legislators at the high level, because this is still their top priority, is housing and homelessness. While transportation may not be their top priority, those are, and this is how you get to it. This is one of the key places to really push. So those are my three that I'm going to be keeping an eye on.
Thank you.
All right. With that, can we close out the transportation conversation? I don't see any hands raised online or in person. And move to the legislative agenda in totality. And thank you, Catherine, for being part of this piece.
Thank you. We appreciate your questions, and we'll get back to you with some of.
We look forward to next week.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi.
Jenna, come on up. I'm going to turn it over to Duncan quick. I'll be right back.
Yeah.
Okay, we're moving on to the state legislative agenda. Councilors, you're all familiar with the process from last session, but staff are here and are going to provide an overview on the legislative concepts and priorities that we have now. We have Annalisa Kohler and Jenna Jones. Welcome.
Yeah, good morning, folks. I'll introduce myself since you've been listening to Annalisa talk for quite a bit. I'm Jenna Jones. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the State and Regional Affairs Advisor in the Government Affairs Department, and excited to be here.
Thank you. And Councilors, just again, Annalisa Curler, State Legislative Affairs Manager, she, her pronouns, and also excited to be here twice in one day to talk about all things legislative. So Jenna and I are here today to talk about your state legislative agenda. And we are kicking off our normal process. So this is the first time that we are before you, and we will be before you a couple times in the fall before final adoption in the spring. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so let's talk about the things that we're monitoring in the lead up to session. It's a general election year, so big and exciting things are happening. As many of you know, after the longest walkout in state history, there are a number of Republicans who are barred from re-election. So we're going to see a lot of new Senate Republicans coming this cycle. And so there will be just kind of a shift in personalities and some people who have been long-standing Republican members in the Senate. The other is we have seen a numerous amount of legislative leadership vying for statewide offices who did decent in the primaries and are going to be on the general ballot. And so that has created a shift. As you know, Boley, Attorney General, Secretary of State, all were up this year. So no, not Boley. Treasurer. So 3 of the 4 statewide offices were open, and not including the governor. The other thing is that the legislature referred 3 ballot measures last session. So I'll go over those quickly. One that would allow for impeachment of statewide elected officials by a 2/3 vote of both chambers. The second one creates a compensation commission to determine salaries of various state and elected and appointed officials at the state level. And then the third one would add ranked choice voting for all federal seats and statewide seats, but not the legislature. So yes, they would not be subject to ranked choice voting, but everything else, our congressional seats, all that would be subject to ranked choice voting if it passes. So look to see how those do in November. And then both chambers are 1 seat away from a supermajority. And there are a number of swing districts in both the House and the Senate, but a lot of people are thinking that there is a real potential for the Senate to have a supermajority in 2025. But that's just speculation at this point. We'll have to see after elections. The next thing, like I said, lots of new leadership because most of legislative leadership is vying for statewide office. We've already seen the shift and gavels turn over. So everyone except for the Senate president is new in leadership positions. So it's exciting for us because we actually have more of a metro and metro region representation in the leadership roles. So we have the one that is not is Speaker Fahey from Eugene. And then we've got in the House, and then we've got the House Majority Leader, Ben Bowman, who's from the Tigard area and Washington County. We've got the House or the Senate Majority Leader with Kathleen Taylor. So lots of cool stuff going on here. And then both of the Ways and Means co-chairs are from this region, but that has been that way for a while. There is a new Senate Ways and Means co-chair. Former Senate Majority Leader Kate Lieber is now the Senate co-chair of Ways and Means. So next slide.
So just a reminder, counselors, as we're building out your legislative agenda, this is for a long session. And what that typically means is that unlike short session, which is more for those budgetary tweaks, small policy changes, this is the session where a lot gets passed. So we anticipate that there will be a number of major policy packages that might move through. It is also the session where the legislature passes its 2-year budget. Typically over 1,000 legislative concepts are introduced. That is not the number of bills that ultimately pass by any means. But it is, well, I tend to describe it as long session is a marathon and short session is a sprint. And so there will be a lot happening starting in January. You know, I think elections will obviously dictate a number of things, but what we're hearing on the early side in terms of possible priorities for the legislature, unsurprisingly, housing production and homelessness still remains a top tier issue. We anticipate that there will be sizable funding and policy changes coming out of that area of work. Similarly with behavioral health, I just spent the last 45 minutes to an hour talking to you about transportation. We anticipate that that will also be a key piece for this session. And then in addition, as I think you're well aware here at the local level, education funding is a top tier issue for a number of constituents and will likely be a conversation that the legislature is going to have. Next slide.
So we wanted to go over our agenda setting process in the long run and kind of walk everyone through. I think most of you are familiar with our process. It's an iterative process, so we'll be before you multiple times before the final adoption of the legislative agenda. And how it really works is we reach out to department leadership and Metro staff. We get feedback from Metro Council. We get feedback from partners like legislators, community organizations, government partners, anyone really that we would do work with in the legislature. And so we kind of have different feedback loops feeding into each other so that we're compiling a good landscape for what's going to happen in 2025 and where the initiatives are, and helping to bring those forward to you all to decide what you want to prioritize. So here's just a couple of things that we'll be doing in front of you. So we're here today in July. This is the initial conversation and kickoff. We'll come to you twice in the fall. One, to just give you an update on all of the outreach and iterative process that we're doing. We'll bring you some initial legislative priorities in our first fall session. These will likely be things you've seen before in prior sessions that still need to be a priority until we get them passed. And then the last one will be, we're going to do a deeper dive into our legislative principles and try to refresh them. So we'll be going through that and hopefully presenting a draft next time. And then our second fall work session will likely be in November after the election. So a lot of dust will have settled. We'll give another update on outreach. We'll do more legislative priorities for consideration because at that point we will probably know what people have requested for bills and what is likely to be introduced in the session. And then in December at your council meeting, we'll do a finalization of legislative principles and priorities. You'll adopt a resolution for those, and then we'll go forth and do the good work for 6 months. Next slide. So here are a couple of concepts that might be of interest to Metro Council. A few of them are new from last year, and some of them you've probably heard before. We know that housing infrastructure and homelessness continue to be big conversations at the state. So right now, the governor's office has 2 frameworks out in the field on housing production and one on homelessness. The production side is really focusing on making more efficient processes to get housing built. There's some infrastructure funding in there, and there's some preservation funding. Particularly. And then on the homelessness side, they're really focusing on systems alignment across different state agencies. We're going to likely make the push for better coordination with local jurisdictions who are also doing this work in systems alignment, and then some heavy emphasis on permanent supportive housing, or PSH, as you may have heard it called. The next thing is, I don't know about you, but batteries, non-lithium or lithium ion batteries cause a lot of fires. They do even at our own transfer stations. And so there's been a lot of momentum across the country about battery EPR, or extended producer responsibility programs. And that will likely come up in the next legislative session. And then right to repair passed last session for all of our things like computers, laptops, that. The coalition is back together, and they're going to be trying to do right to repair for mobility devices and also ag equipment. So I think we'll be more involved in the mobility device conversation, but ways to keep folks able to fix their own stuff and not have to pay someone else to do it, or to keep it out of the landfill. The last one that I'll touch on is recreational immunity. This was a work group was created last session around recreational immunity. We have a couple of folks from Parks sitting on that work group. There may or may not be legislation in 2025, so that is to be determined, and we'll likely be involved in that conversation if it goes forward.
2 other issues I want to flag, and I want to be clear, this list is not meant to be an exhaustive list of your priority. These are the things we know that are definitely out there right now that have legs. I feel like I'm evergreen coming to you to talk about industrial site readiness. I think that will absolutely be a priority for a session, and something that we anticipate working on. In addition, the longstanding priority of guns at public venues and gun safety will likely also be a topic of conversation, we anticipate. Next slide, please. And then what about transportation? Obviously, we just had a whole discussion about that, but just know that that will obviously be a top topic during session. And we will be working on that with you as well. Next slide. So in terms of next steps, Jenna really laid out the iterative process that is your agenda setting. So we will be back before you again in the fall. But in the meantime, between now and then, Jenna and I will be having a number of conversations with our government partners, with community groups, with the business community, with legislators, to begin to understand even in more detail what their possible priorities are, what they are thinking about for session, ways and opportunities for us to partner with them and then bring to you new ideas, those types of things. We will also be continuing to have conversations, obviously with you all and with Metro staff about what their needs are and what they are hearing. And then we will be back before you, I believe, probably sometime in October with something that's a little bit more formal and on paper in terms of possible priorities for your consideration. Next slide.
Yeah. So this is the exciting part. This is my favorite part, is to hear what you all think, both about our process of what we laid out, and then if there are any particular issue areas or specific legislative priorities that you would like to see in 2025 on your legislative agenda.
Counselors, thoughts? Counselor Wong.
Yes, thank you, Madam President. The governor had a pretty large priority on downtown Portland over the last couple of years. Are we going to see anything to kind of continue that momentum? Has that come up at all?
Yeah, so Councillor Wong, a little bit of the downtown task force stuff happened last session, primarily around ODOT cleaning up their right of ways. That was the biggest thing that we saw. I think we'll see a little bit more of that kind of woven throughout some of the state's agenda. I'm interested to see how big of a piece it will be in kind of the both behavioral health, housing, homelessness intersection. But I think there were some other things around, parks and arts and culture that were in her downtown task force recommendations that I have heard less about. So would definitely need to check into that. But if I hear something, I'll get back to you.
And also just on some of our other responsibilities, like the performing arts venues or expo and, other things we're thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
Are we considering those for this session as well?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think we are certainly having some initial conversations. I think it depends, thinking about Expo or the Keller, for example, which I think are two top of mind possible state funding asks. I think we're trying to figure out the correct timing on when those funding asks should occur and whether or not it's this session or perhaps a future session. They're at, different points in their processes. And so making sure we're aligning with when is the appropriate time to make that ask. But regardless, I think there is interest in us doing some education work at the state level that, even if we're not coming with the ask in 2025, to make sure that state legislators are aware of both of those projects and the need for possible future funding.
Counselor Simpson.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you again for that presentation, Annalise and Jenna. Always good to get our priorities out. A question for you, where is workforce prioritized in all of this? Because all of the elements that we talked about, from homelessness, behavioral health to housing to transportation, the glue that binds all of that together is making sure people have quality jobs. There's big efforts happening in East County around that, but more so it could be beneficial. Everybody's working in the state and they could possibly have better employment in the state. So where are we on workforce? Well, where is that on the list for the legislature? And then also in supporting industry so that we can recruit the good jobs here and bring industry in.
I'll talk workforce, you talk industry.
Yep.
So on the workforce piece, I think we see it a little bit like siloed across issue areas. Everyone's got their kind of workforce piece that we see coming up. We have a general workforce principle in our legislative principles. So we see some of the same needs in things from like construction on different infrastructure projects, making sure people have childcare so that they can go to work. They see a lot of apprenticeship models. We're seeing more in the behavioral health and housing space with just like provider burnout for service providers. So I think all of them are a little bit niche in how we're interacting with them, but there is while they have some similarities, it's not a silver bullet for every industry. So I think we'll continue to see it be siloed at the state level, but it's definitely in every conversation, depending on what line of business we're talking about and what issue area we're talking about. And about industry and how we're helping them. I'll let Annalisa answer that.
Yeah, I mean, Counselor Simpson, we have a strong economic development priority that is also important to us. And I think, a key part of that, we just in a conversation yesterday with some community partners about childcare and making sure we're, advancing efforts to support that. And then, so everything from kind of that to industrial site readiness to supporting things like Keller and Expo, how are we getting economic development into our state? I think, Metro Council President was just talking about the connection between transportation and housing. There's obviously equally a strong connection between economic development and transportation. And so I really feel like it's woven throughout a lot of the work that we're doing.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you for that. I just, for me, especially like the work piece, because I don't know, it's something that I don't see us really as a state having a real clear focus on, knowing that like there's so much need, particularly in communities of color that have historically been left out of the socioeconomic processes, and they constantly live in poverty census tracts that are consistently in poverty. And so like really addressing those issues. And I think, it goes beyond jobs, because once you get stable and get a job, then it's maintaining that job and doing all the things. And so I know that this is a larger conversation. I just hope that it's a conversation that we're saying explicitly and it's just not being woven through conversation.
Yeah, if I could just build on that, I think, from my perspective, there'll probably be some more conversation around the chips manufacturing, workforce development, both on the construction of any new facilities as well as those who work in the plants themselves. I think that's great. And I think that should be up there on the top priorities. I think the question is what is 2 and what is 3, right? I think that's what Councilor Simpson is trying to get at. There are priority tracks that we get onto. And how can we affect number 2 and number 3, not just go along with number 1? And so I hear the daycare and I hear the construction. I guess I would ask, like, what's the next step on the free community college? Like, where's the ties? Where can we be additive in those conversations? I don't know. I'm grasping at my kind of thin knowledge on this, but I want to just pull out the fact that we know the chips manufacturing is out there. It's going to be number 1 for the legislature because they want to bring the money in from the feds. But then what is 2 and 3? Rather than just being kind of, it's all good. It is all good. But if chips starts taking up all the space, then where are we in the diversification of the economics of our region? That's into the ether. You don't need to answer that.
Yeah, no, I was like,
I saw you look like, how do I answer that?
no, I was like, okay, something to ponder. That was the face.
Yeah, okay. Anyway, I think it would be better if we could be a little bit more specific about what we think we're trying to achieve or who we're trying to promote because of.
Okay.
Okay. Anything else? Oh, Councilor Nolan.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I would like, and I don't have a specific legislative concept to submit, but I'd like for us, as we try to support efforts that will result in additional housing production, particularly for unsubsidized workforce housing. Talk around some of the tables around there is that the approval mechanisms are unique to each individual jurisdiction. Cities usually run the building codes and permitting process. Is there a role that the state could play, either through incentives or regulations, that would push to streamlining, or perhaps creating some sort of standardized, if you do your plans for housing production within this framework, and if you make some commitment, if it's rental property, to long-term self-funded, affordable, to at 100 to 120% of AMI, then you get to go to the front of the line, or you get some other benefit. Because if you're waiting around 18 months for a permit, the value of going to the front of the line and getting that permit in 6 months instead is real money, especially in an era when you've got really high interest rates. And I don't know if that's the right proposal, but I'd like to see Metro engaged in trying to create incentives for unsubsidized workforce housing.
Yeah, Councilor Nolan, I think we've seen the state also grapple with this over the last couple of sessions. It is one of those moments where is it a carrot that works or is it a stick that works? And our folks who implement that on the ground level have some thoughts and how they would like the approach to be. I think that we're going to see the focus of what you're talking about, the unsubsidized workforce housing from 80 to 120, that has been really prevalent in the conversations lately for about the last 2 years. I think now having a housing accountability and production office, one of their tasks is kind of trying to find those incentives to get local governments or tools to facilitate development. One of the things we also saw last session, and I think they will build on, is producing kind of safe harbor model codes for different size jurisdictions and stuff like that. So I'm not saying that that's the silver bullet and it's going to solve everything. There's a lot of details on all of the different permitting and development stuff that needs to be worked out. And there's a lot of different solutions on the table or in the conversation. But I think just generally those conversations are happening. I think people do see the need. Where those end up is still to be seen. And so I will go back through some of the notes that I have and tables I've been a part of, and I can follow up on what's kind of being discussed.
Thanks.
Okay, I don't mean to end this on a sad note, but it sounds like Senator Peter Courtney has passed away. It's just
Sorry?
reported, so that he has passed away. Senator Courtney has passed away, former Senator Courtney. So if we could just have a moment of silence. He was a leader in our legislature for quite some time, and was I think a good friend of the Portland Metro region and a lot of projects. But if we could just have a moment of silence. Okay. And I think we should reach out and talk to whoever we need to talk to pass on our condolences. Okay. With that, thank you both for all of the work that you do and getting us to where we are today. And we look forward to the next conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, counselors, COO communication, we have Deputy COO Andrew Scott.
Great. Thank you. Good conversation today on all fronts. Just one quick thing. I wanted to just highlight the annual Lamprey celebration that happened last Friday. This was hosted by Critfic, the Yakima Nation, and other tribes such as Warm Springs, Umatilla, and the Nez Perce tribe. Councilors Lewis and Rosenthal joined a number of Metro staff and volunteers at the event in Oregon City. And the event, the annual Lamprey celebration, was designed to honor both Willamette Falls and the Pacific lamprey, which is a sacred first food for the region's tribes. I had an opportunity to go as well. Personally, I found it to be a really amazing and educational and inspiring event. We heard from a number of speakers. We were able to experience traditional cultural songs and dances. We took a boat tour up to the falls, which is the first time I'd gotten that close to Willamette Falls, which was really neat. And then I was also able to taste my first lamprey, which was very interesting, along with salmon and other delicious
like
foods.
chicken?
They had a little bit. It starts off like chicken, finishes like fish. So, but it was a good experience. Actually, my daughter was able to come as well, and she was a huge fan, actually, of the lamprey. So, anyway, if you haven't had an opportunity to attend, I would encourage folks to do it next year. I found it a great event. Glad we were able to help sponsor it. That's all I have.
Was able to attend last year. It was good.
Yeah, it was really
good. All right, counselors, any communication? Counselor Rosenthal.
Yeah, I have a couple of things to communicate. First of all, I just want to give kudos to Andy Shaw, who gave a spot-on presentation to the Washington County Chamber today about the housing and supportive services. The only point of uncertainty still is the balance between long-term rental assistance and new construction for people who need support in their housing. So that's an issue that he mentioned is still something that is being worked on. So that's one thing. Also want to note that the TV Highway Steering Committee voted unanimously to support the CIG process, which is a $300 million project that is that can be eligible for federal funds. But the main point there is the hard work that the staff did to make this possible, to come down and come up with a plan that met the goals for all the different communities, Forest Grove, Cornelius, Hillsborough, and Beaverton, and yet would fit within the funding guidelines. And so that was a very positive result there. Andy Scott was at the Kritvik Yakima tribe, the four treaty tribes, the Yakimas, the Warm Springs, the Umatillas, and the Nez Perce. And he's right. Lamprey is definitely an acquired taste. It's not something you just immediately want to indulge in great quantities of, but it was a good year for a lamprey apparently, and they're always back. Obviously the CTGR was somewhat conspicuous by their absence from this gathering. And that is, just part of the politics of that, the Willamette Falls area. Then two other things. The Washington County Coordinating Committee met yesterday and basically voiced unanimous support. And there will be a letter that they will send supporting the Sherwood proposal for expanding the UGB. They seem to be particularly concerned about the jobs issues. And then in one other thing I want to mention that the Tualatin held a Viva Tualatin festival. Metro sponsored the music stage. And so we had a nice banner. We didn't have a booth, but we had a nice banner in front of the music stage. So everybody knew Metro was supporting. Nobody knew what Metro was, but it was a very nice family affair with some good music. So that's it.
Thank you. Anybody else? Counselor Nolan.
Since we've just mentioned it, I'd like to make sure people know and our audience knows that the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde had a powwow over the weekend, and that explains their absence.
There we go. All right, just for the good of the order, on Thursday, 25th, we will be spending some more time on the supportive housing service next steps. I believe we will be coming to you just to reaffirm what you'd like to see in a resolution and ordinance in the short term. That's short-term things that we can change that are under our authority and that we can get consensus on. Then come to you the following week with more of a project timeline to get to and prepare for going to the ballot in May if we so choose, with the other things that need to go to the ballot that we can get consensus on. So just so you know, that's moving along. We continue, I think, in all haste because we need to make sure that in our role as oversight, we are working to make things more efficient and to provide more information and more data to folks so that they know how their money is being used. So, Councilor Simpson, sorry, I didn't see you.
No worries, Madam President. I'm just real quick. I just want to convey to the council and the public, just be safe. We had a few incidents over the weekend here locally that involved homicides here in District 1 at the Gleason boat launch. Condolences to both of those families and the loved ones. But this is when we talk about jobs and access to quality living, this is what I'm talking about. This is what I want to help address in this community is, I know we'll never reduce gun violence to zero, but as much as we can and as possible, I think it's our due diligence to make sure that we're trying to provide everybody access so that they don't have to resort to a life on the streets. it was just unfortunate that had to happen. And, realistically, a lot of gunplay happened over the weekend. And I just want everybody to be safe. I think we need to, across a lot of spectrums in communities, just cool down the rhetoric, understand that we are all neighbors. We're friends. This is our region together, and we need to act like it.
Thank you. Wise words to end the meeting on. Much appreciated. All right, with that, we are adjourned, and our next council meeting is Thursday, July 18th, 10:30 a.m. See y'all there.